A desert town was dying behind iron fences while children begged for water beneath the burning sun. Before the people realized the truth, a wounded black horse already sensed life hidden beneath the dead land. The rider thought Dustwell was just another broken town, until thirst began turning neighbors into enemies. A powerful landowner controlled the last well in the desert, and fear kept an entire town kneeling before him. But while grown men fought over survival, one little girl shared her final cup of water with a dying horse. Tonight's story is about thirst, mercy, and the quiet ways God sometimes saves people through broken souls that still choose kindness. Before we ride into Dustwell, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ride with the rider and ghost. Dustwell appeared slowly through the desert haze, like a town that had been forgotten by mercy long ago. The rider saw it first from the top of a dry sandstone ridge shortly before sunset. The roofs looked sun-bleached and brittle beneath the heat. Dust moved constantly through the streets like smoke from an invisible fire. Nothing in the town reflected light except the iron fencing surrounding the central well. Even from far away, the fence stood out like a cage built around survival itself. The rider sat heavily in the saddle, exhaustion pulling at his shoulders beneath the long, dark leather duster hanging from his thin frame. At 45, he carried the kind of face the desert carved slowly over decades. Weathered tan skin, sharp cheekbones, tired gray-brown eyes that rarely stopped studying danger, and a rough beard touched by early streaks of gray. Sweat and dust darkened the collar of his charcoal shirt beneath the black western vest. His black hat cast a shadow over his expression, but exhaustion had begun breaking through even his usual silence. Ghost looked worse. The tall black quarter horse moved carefully down the slope beside him, each step slower than usual. Dust covered the old whip scars crossing Ghost's shoulders. The horse's breathing came heavier now, nostrils dry and slightly cracked from weeks crossing dead desert land. The faded white star on Ghost's forehead looked dull beneath layers of red sand. One rear leg still carried the old limp from earlier injuries, but now dehydration weakened the rest of the body too. Still, Ghost's ears continued moving constantly, alert to every distant sound in the valley below. The rider uncapped his water flask while they descended into town. Only a few mouthfuls remained. He held it toward Ghost. The horse lowered his head, sniffed the water, then slowly nudged the flask back toward him. "You're stubborn," the rider muttered quietly. Ghost only blinked tiredly. By the time they entered Dustwell, sunset had turned the desert sky copper red. The town smelled like hot iron, dry wood, sweat, and hopelessness. Long lines of exhausted people waited beside the fenced well, carrying empty buckets and rusted cans. Children sat against walls with cracked lips and hollow eyes, too tired to cry anymore. Dead goats and cattle lay near abandoned barns because nobody had enough water left to keep animals alive. The rider passed a man trading his wedding ring for 2 small jugs of muddy water, while armed guards watched nearby without emotion. Ghost slowed again near the crowd. A small boy reached toward the horse weakly, staring at the canteen hanging from the saddle. Without hesitation, Ghost nudged the canteen downward toward the child. The rider watched silently for a second before unscrewing the cap himself. The boy drank desperately while his mother cried quietly beside him. The rider stared at Ghost afterward. The horse had barely enough strength left for himself. Yet somehow Ghost still reacted to thirst in others before protecting his own survival. The fenced well sat in the center of Dustwell like a throne guarded by rifles. Thick iron bars surrounded the stone structure. Wooden signs listed water prices, beside contracts offering land purchases in exchange for guaranteed access. Several armed men stood watch beneath canvas shade structures. rifles hanging casually against their shoulders, and beside the well stood Silas Vane. Silas looked strangely untouched by the suffering around him. Around 60 years old, tall and lean, with neatly combed silver hair, pale skin protected from years beneath shaded porches, and a cream-white vest somehow free of dust despite the desert winds. His face remained calm and controlled, but not cruel in the theatrical way the rider had seen in Killers and Outlaws before. Silas spoke softly to the guards beside him. No shouting, no threats, only cold certainty. People listened because thirst made certainty feel powerful. Silas noticed the newcomer immediately. His pale eyes moved from the rider to Ghost, lingering briefly on the horse's condition. "You won't last long out there anymore," Silas said evenly. "Neither will the horse." The rider said nothing. Silas folded his hands behind his back. Dustwell survives because somebody controls what's left. Without rules, people kill each other for water. I learned that years ago. There was something strange in his voice when he said it. Not pride, memory. Ghost suddenly shifted uneasily beside the fence, staring toward the deeper storage tanks behind the guarded well. Silas noticed that too. "Smart animal," he said quietly. "Smarter than most people." Before the rider could answer, a woman's voice called from across the street. "You shouldn't stand here too long unless you plan on selling your soul." The rider turned toward the speaker. Miriam Vale stood beneath the faded awning of a small relief kitchen near the edge of the square. She looked around 42, tall and thin from years of surviving on too little herself. Her dark hair, streaked lightly with gray, had been tied low behind her neck to keep it away from the heat. Sunburn darkened her skin, and exhaustion rested beneath her tired brown eyes, but kindness still survived there somehow. Her sleeves remained rolled up from cooking, revealing forearms marked by old burns and hard work. Children crowded quietly near her tables, eating watered-down stew from cracked bowls. Miriam looked at Ghost first before speaking to the rider again. "That horse needs water before tomorrow," she said. "Real water." The rider led Ghost toward the kitchen while Silas watched silently behind them. Inside the shaded relief area, Miriam handed him a small cup of clean water without asking for money. "Most people here stopped sharing months ago," she admitted. "Thirst changes people." The rider glanced toward the fenced well again. "And him." Miriam followed his eyes toward Silas. "Silas believes fear keeps order alive. Maybe once he was right. Maybe once he tried helping people. Doesn't matter now." Ghost stood near the edge of the shade, breathing slowly. Children gathered carefully around him. Despite weakness, Ghost lowered his head gently toward them, allowing tiny hands to touch the dusty black fur along his neck. Then the rehook came. One of Silas's guards approached carrying a metal bucket. "For the horse," the guard said. The rider frowned slightly. Ghost sniffed the water for a very long time, then stepped backward. The horse refused to drink. The guard rolled his eyes. Spoiled animal, but Ghost's ears pinned back hard. Something was wrong. The rider crouched beside the bucket, dipping 2 fingers into the water before smelling them. Metal, rotten mineral residue, cheap, contaminated water from shallow dead wells outside town. Water meant for poor workers. The clean reserves remained hidden behind Silas's fenced storage tanks. The rider slowly looked back toward the guarded well. Ghost had known before he did. The horse didn't fear the town. Ghost understood survival was being divided between human beings. Night settled slowly over Dustwell after that. Wind pushed dust through empty streets while lanterns flickered weakly behind cracked windows. Ghost lay near Miriam's kitchen, too tired to stand for long now. The rider sat beside him against the wooden wall, staring out toward the fenced well glowing beneath guard lanterns. Then small footsteps approached quietly through the dark. A little girl, around 8 years old, stopped beside Ghost, holding a dented tin cup with both hands. Her brown hair looked sunburned from years beneath desert heat, and her oversized brown eyes carried the cautious sadness of a child who had seen too much hunger too early. Her faded dress hung loosely from her thin frame. Without speaking, she held the cup toward Ghost. Only a few inches of water remained inside. The rider opened his mouth to refuse, but Ghost slowly lifted his head. The horse drank only one small mouthful, then gently pushed the cup back toward the girl. The little girl smiled for the first time all night. "My name's Lucy Ross," she whispered softly. And for the first time since entering Dustwell, the rider felt something inside the dying town, still refusing to dry out completely. Morning arrived over Dustwell without softness. The sun climbed slowly through a pale gray sky, already thick with heat, and the town began suffering long before noon. The rider woke beside the relief kitchen, with sand covering part of his coat and Ghost standing nearby beneath the weak shade of a warped wooden awning. The black horse looked worse than yesterday. The muscles beneath the dusty coat twitched occasionally from dehydration, and the old limp in the rear leg had grown more visible after the desert crossing. Thin lines of dried salt marked the edges of Ghost's nostrils. Yet despite exhaustion, the horse remained alert, ears turning constantly toward sounds drifting through town. Coughing children, arguments near the well, the distant creak of windmills that no longer pumped anything useful from the dead earth. Lucy Ross sat nearby on an overturned crate, watching Ghost carefully while holding the dented tin cup against her chest like something sacred. In daylight, she looked even smaller than the rider first realized. 8 years old at most. Thin shoulders, dusty brown hair, unevenly cut with scissors long gone dull. Sunburned skin stretched tight from too many weeks without enough food or water, but her eyes stood out immediately. Large brown eyes carrying the strange silence some children developed after witnessing adults lose hope too many times. Ghost lowered his head toward her slowly. Lucy smiled faintly and touched the horse's nose. "You're still thirsty," she whispered. Ghost nudged the empty tin cup softly. The rider watched the interaction while tightening the worn saddle straps. Something about it unsettled him in a quiet way. He had seen men kill each other over water before. He had seen towns burn because fear spread faster than mercy. But Ghost, exhausted, half dehydrated, barely standing steady some mornings, still refused to take more than he needed from a child. The horse still remembered restraint while people forgot it every day. "You let him drink before you drink yourself?" the rider finally asked. Lucy shrugged slightly. "Ghost looks more tired than me." The answer hit harder than expected. Before he could respond, heavy footsteps approached through the sand. Caleb Ross emerged from the alley beside the relief kitchen carrying firewood under one arm. He stood around 45, broad-shouldered despite years of hunger and desert labor. His missing left arm ended just below the elbow, beneath the sleeve of an old military coat, faded almost gray by dust and sun. Deep lines crossed his face beneath a rough, dark beard streaked with dirt and early silver. Caleb moved with constant caution, the posture of a man who expected violence long before it arrived. His remaining hand tightened instinctively when he noticed the rider watching Lucy. "Morning," Caleb said flatly. The rider nodded once. Caleb set the firewood beside Miriam's stove, then crouched near Lucy. Despite the hard edges in his face, his expression softened immediately around his daughter. "You bothering the horse again?" Lucy shook her head. "Ghost likes me." Caleb glanced toward the horse carefully. Ghost stood unusually calm around the child, even lowering his head enough for Lucy to scratch behind the ears. That alone seemed to surprise Caleb. Most animals in Dustwell had become aggressive from thirst months ago. Animals know things, Caleb muttered quietly, usually before people do. Miriam overheard him while pouring thin soup into cracked bowls for children gathering near the kitchen tables. The widow looked exhausted this morning. Shadows sat heavily beneath her brown eyes, and streaks of gray in her dark tied-back hair showed more clearly beneath the rising sunlight. But she still moved constantly between children, adjusting blankets, handing out bread, touching foreheads to check fever. The rider noticed she always fed the youngest first. "You should leave Dustwell while you still can," Miriam said quietly without looking at him. Most smart people already did. "Why didn't you?" he asked. Miriam paused for several seconds before answering. Somebody had to stay for the ones too small to run. That answer explained more about her than any long story could. Later that afternoon, the rider walked with Caleb toward the fenced well, while Ghost followed slowly behind. Dustwell looked worse in daylight. Entire buildings stood abandoned after families traded. Their homes for water contracts then disappeared west, searching for work. Men argued openly in the streets now. People stared at each other's canteens longer than they used to. Thirst had started removing shame from desperation. Caleb spoke quietly as they walked. Silas wasn't always like this. The rider glanced sideways. Caleb spit dust into the sand. First year of drought, he opened the wells for everybody. Didn't charge a cent. People praised him like some kind of saint. What changed? Caleb's expression darkened. The riots. The former soldier looked toward the fenced well ahead of them. One night the pumps slowed almost dry. Folks panicked, started fighting over buckets. Somebody fired a gun. By morning, Silas's wife and boy were dead near the pumps. The rider stayed silent. Caleb rubbed the scarred edge of his missing arm unconsciously. After that, Silas decided mercy was weakness, said kindness turns people savage once survival gets involved. "And you?" the rider asked. Caleb gave a humorless smile. "I think thirst was already there inside people. Drought just exposed it." The rehook came after sunset. Ghost disappeared. The rider realized it only after Miriam finished serving dinner. The saddle rope hung loose beside the stable wall, and hoofprints led away into the dark outskirts beyond Dustwell. Caleb grabbed a lantern immediately. "Horse shouldn't wander out there alone," he warned. The three followed Ghost's tracks beyond the last houses near the edge of the desert. Wind pushed colder air through the rocks as night deepened. Ghost's hoofprints moved slowly, uneven from weakness, but purposeful. Finally, they found the horse standing beside a collapsed stone structure, half buried beneath sand and fallen rock, an old well. Ghost lowered his head repeatedly toward the ground, sniffing slowly. The rider crouched nearby. At first, he noticed nothing except dry dirt. Then, coolness, very faint. Caleb frowned and knelt beside the horse. With his remaining hand, he dug through loose sand near the old stones. Several inches lower, the dirt darkened slightly. Moisture, not water, but dampness, real dampness. Caleb froze. Miriam stared at the ground silently, almost afraid to breathe. Ghost pawed once against the dirt beside the collapsed well. The horse wasn't hearing hidden water like some miracle creature. Ghost smelled it, felt the cooler air rising through cracks beneath the stone. The rider slowly looked back toward Dustwell, glowing faintly in the distance. All this time, the town believed survival existed only behind Silas Vane's iron fence. Maybe fear had made them stop searching anywhere else. Ghost lifted his tired head toward him, and for the first time since entering Dustwell, the rider felt something dangerous beginning to rise beneath the dying town. Hope. The heat arrived earlier the next morning, rolling across Dustwell before sunrise like a punishment the town already knew by heart. By the time the first light touched the roofs, people were already standing outside the iron fence surrounding Silas Vane's well. Some carried empty buckets. Others carried paper deeds to their homes folded carefully inside coat pockets. The rider watched them from Miriam Vale's kitchen porch, while Ghost stood nearby beneath the narrow strip of shade, breathing slowly through dry nostrils. The black horse looked thinner already. Days without enough water had sharpened the outlines of Ghost's ribs beneath the dusty coat. The old scars crossing the shoulders seemed darker beneath the morning heat. Every movement took more effort now, but the horse still watched the town constantly, especially the well, especially the locked storage tanks behind it. Lucy sat beside Ghost quietly with the dented tin cup in her lap. She had stopped asking adults questions because most answers in Dustwell eventually became disappointments. Instead, she studied people carefully, the way hungry children often did. Ghost lowered his head slightly beside her, exhausted but calm. "You don't trust him either," Lucy whispered toward the horse. Ghost's ears flicked once toward the fenced well. The rider stepped down from the porch and adjusted the revolver belt hanging low on his waist. He had no intention of using it unless forced, but Dustwell felt like the kind of town where fear could ignite faster than gunpowder. Caleb Ross emerged from the alley carrying a shovel across his remaining shoulder. The former soldier looked more tired than yesterday. Dust covered the knees of his old military trousers, and dark circles had deepened beneath eyes that rarely relaxed anymore. Caleb's missing arm made every movement harder beneath the desert heat, but he refused help whenever Miriam offered. "People are getting desperate," Caleb muttered while staring toward the well. "Last night somebody stabbed a man over a half bucket." The rider nodded silently. "That's exactly what Silas wants," Miriam said from behind them. She stepped outside carrying a crate of stale bread for the children gathering nearby. Sweat already darkened strands of black and gray hair near her neck despite the early hour. The tired kindness in her face remained, but fear had begun settling deeper beneath it now. "He keeps people thirsty enough to obey," she continued quietly, "and scared enough to blame each other instead of him." The rider looked toward the iron fence again. Silas Vane stood near the gate, speaking calmly with several guards. Even in brutal desert heat, the wealthy landowner remained strangely composed. His cream-colored vest looked freshly cleaned, silver hair perfectly combed, pale skin protected beneath wide canvas shade, while the rest of Dustwell burned around him. But there was exhaustion hiding beneath his control too, the kind born from years spent trying to prevent chaos by tightening his grip on everything. The rider walked toward the well alone. Ghost lifted his head immediately, watching him go. The crowd parted uneasily as the rider approached the fence. People in Dustwell had started recognizing him now. The wandering cowboy traveling with the dying black horse that refused to drink poisoned water. Silas noticed him immediately. "You're still here," Silas said evenly. "For now." Silas studied him for several quiet seconds before speaking again. "You found the old well outside town." The rider's expression didn't change. "You got people watching me?" "I have people watching everybody," Silas replied calmly. "That's how towns survive drought." The rider glanced toward the storage tanks behind the fence. "By locking water behind iron," Silas followed his gaze. "By controlling panic." The wind pushed dust between them. Silas rested both hands behind his back. "You think I enjoy this?" he asked quietly. "First year of drought, I opened everything. No prices, no contracts. People thanked me for 2 weeks. His pale eyes drifted toward the crowd outside the fence. Then the pumps started failing. For the first time, emotion touched his voice. They tore each other apart. The rider stayed silent. Silas swallowed once before continuing. "My wife tried protecting our son near the well during the riots. Somebody fired into the crowd. By Morning, both were dead in the dirt while people fought over spilled water. The noise around the well faded beneath the memory in his voice. When survival starts dying, Silas said softly, mercy becomes dangerous. The rider studied him carefully then. Not a monster, a man who buried grief beneath control until fear hardened into philosophy. Ghost suddenly shifted uneasily outside the fence, the black horse's ears pinned back towards the storage sheds behind the well. A low, uneasy sound rumbled in the animal's throat. Silas noticed immediately. "He smells the reserves," Silas said. The rider frowned slightly. "There's more water back there than you admit." Silas didn't deny it. "There's enough to keep part of Dustwell alive through another season," he answered calmly. "Not enough for everyone." Behind them, voices suddenly rose near Miriam's kitchen. The rider turned sharply. 3 guards were overturning water barrels beside the relief tables while children scrambled backward in fear. One of the men kicked over a crate of food into the dirt. Miriam stood between them and the children, despite shaking hands. "That water was for sick people," she shouted. A tall guard with a scar crossing his shaved scalp grabbed her arm roughly. The man looked around 35, thick-necked and sunburned, with the dead, impatient eyes of someone who stopped seeing suffering individually a long time ago. "Orders are orders," he snapped. The rider moved immediately. So did Caleb, but Ghost moved first. The rehook came violently, despite exhaustion, despite dehydration, despite barely standing steady an hour earlier. Ghost shoved through the crowd toward Miriam. The black horse stepped directly between her and the guard, just as the man raised the rifle butt to strike her. Ghost trembled badly, the horse's legs nearly buckled beneath weakness. But Ghost did not move aside. Children hid behind the horse instinctively. The scarred guard froze. For one strange second, the entire square fell silent except for blowing dust. Ghost stared directly at the man. Not aggressive, not wild, just refusing to let him hurt the woman feeding the children. The rider reached Ghost seconds later, one hand gripping the horse's neck gently to steady the trembling body. Even now, Ghost's breathing sounded dangerous, yet the horse still positioned himself between danger and the weak. The scarred guard slowly lowered the rifle. Caleb stepped beside Miriam, jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Silas approached the scene calmly after several seconds. He looked at Ghost for a long moment, then at the children hiding behind the exhausted horse. Something unreadable crossed his face before disappearing again. Finally, he addressed the entire square. 3 days, Silas announced coldly. Anyone refusing land contracts will lose water access completely. Fear spread through the crowd instantly. Some people looked furious. Others looked defeated. A woman near the back started crying quietly. The rider felt Ghost leaning slightly against his shoulder now from exhaustion. The horse had spent nearly the last of his strength protecting people who could offer nothing in return. Silas turned toward the rider one final time. "You still think people stay civilized without control?" he asked. The rider looked toward the frightened children, the armed guards, the desperate faces surrounding the well, then down at Ghost. The dying horse had just shown more restraint than most humans in Dustwell. "No," the rider answered quietly. "I think they forget who they are when somebody owns the thing keeping them alive." Silas said nothing after that. The wealthy landowner simply walked back behind the iron fence, while Dustwell watched him like prisoners watching weather. And above the dry silence of the square, Ghost's breathing remained heavy beside the rider's shoulder. The third morning arrived carrying heat sharp enough to hurt breathing. Dustwell no longer looked like a town waiting for survival. It looked like a town waiting for violence. Before sunrise, people had already gathered outside Silas Vane's iron fence. Mothers held feverish children wrapped in thin blankets, damp with sweat. Elderly men leaned against broken carts because dehydration made standing difficult. Hollow-eyed workers carried shovels, pickaxes, and rusted rifles not because they wanted war, but because thirst had started convincing them they no longer had another language left. The rider stood near the edge of the crowd beside Ghost, while wind pushed red dust through the square. His dark coat hung open beneath the brutal desert heat, revealing sweat-darkened charcoal fabric beneath the black western vest. His tired, gray-brown eyes moved constantly between the crowd and the armed guards protecting the well. Too many frightened people, too many guns, too little water. Ghost stood beside him, trembling faintly. The black horse looked dangerously weak now. Dust clung to the dull coat covering the ribs beginning to show beneath the skin. The old scars across Ghost's shoulders looked raw beneath sunlight. Cracks had formed near the edges of the horse's mouth from dehydration, and the rear leg carrying the old limp shook occasionally whenever Ghost shifted weight. But the horse's ears never stopped moving, still listening, still watching, still reacting to something humans kept missing. Lucy Ross held Ghost's reins carefully while standing close to Miriam's relief wagon. The little girl's faded dress moved softly in the hot wind, and the dented tin cup still hung from one small hand. Her oversized brown eyes studied the growing crowd with visible fear now. "People look different today," Lucy whispered quietly. Miriam crouched beside her. The widow looked exhausted beyond hiding it anymore. Dust covered her dark hair, streaked with gray, and her face had grown thinner from giving away more food and water than she kept for herself. "They're scared," Miriam answered gently. Lucy shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "They look angry." The rider overheard that and knew the child was right. Near the fence, Caleb Ross shoved two men apart before a fistfight could begin over a water ration ticket. Sweat soaked the old military coat hanging from his broad shoulders. The former soldier's rough beard looked darker with dust and heat, and frustration sharpened the lines beneath his tired eyes. Losing his left arm years earlier had not weakened him physically nearly as much as Dustwell had weakened him emotionally. "You start fighting now," Caleb shouted toward the crowd. "Your kids die thirsty before sunset." Some listened. Others barely heard him anymore. At the center of the square, Silas Vane emerged beneath the shade near the well gate. Even now, the wealthy landowner looked controlled and composed. His cream-colored vest remained clean despite the storm of dust blowing through town. Silver hair neatly combed, pale face calm. Too calm. That calmness frightened people more than shouting would have. Silas raised one hand slowly. The guards tightened formation near the gate. "If contracts are signed today," Silas announced clearly, "water distribution continues tomorrow." Murmurs spread through the crowd instantly. Fear, hatred, desperation. One exhausted woman near the front collapsed while holding a baby against her chest. Another man screamed that Silas was murdering the town. Several workers surged forward before Caleb physically blocked them with his remaining arm. The rider stepped between the guards and crowd instinctively. Nobody noticed Ghost moving. Not at first. The horse suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the storage buildings behind the main well. The rider saw the change immediately. Ghost's nostrils widened, ears pinned forward. A strange, restless sound rumbled deep in the exhausted animal's throat. Ghost smelled something. Water, a lot of it. The rider turned toward the storage sheds just as several guards shifted nervously in front of the doors, and then the rehook happened. Ghost moved. Not with strength, not with speed. The black horse nearly stumbled during the first few steps. Weak legs shook violently beneath the exhausted body. But Ghost kept going, dragging himself toward the storage sheds behind the fence, while people stared in confusion. "Ghost!" Lucy cried out. The rider pushed through the crowd after him. One guard raised his rifle nervously. Then Ghost slammed weakly against a wooden water cart beside the storage building. A barrel tipped over. Clean water spilled across the dirt. The entire square froze. Not muddy mineral water, not ration sludge. Clear water. Another barrel rolled loose behind it. Then another. The crowd saw everything. Rows of hidden reserves stacked behind the fence while children outside fainted from thirst. Silas's secret no longer belonged to him. The silence lasted only seconds before rage exploded through Dustwell. People surged toward the fence screaming. Several guards panicked and raised rifles. The rider drew his revolver instantly. "Don't fire!" he roared. Caleb tackled one desperate miner before the man could stab a guard with a shovel. Another worker smashed part of the fence apart with a pickaxe. Mothers screamed. Children cried. Dust filled the air thick enough to choke. Ghost staggered backward from the chaos, barely remaining upright. The rider holstered his revolver and grabbed the broken fence gate instead. "Water first!" he shouted toward the crowd. "Children first!" Nobody listened immediately. Then Miriam did something unexpected. The exhausted widow climbed onto an overturned crate and screamed louder than anyone in the square. "If you kill each other now," she shouted through tears, "then Dustwell deserves to die." The words hit harder than gunfire. People hesitated. Caleb seized the moment immediately. "Line up the sick first," he ordered. The rider and Caleb forced open the storage sheds completely. Inside sat enough clean water to keep Dustwell alive, weeks longer than anyone believed. Not enough forever, but enough to matter. The crowd nearly collapsed inward again until the rider physically shoved several men backward. "Kids first," he repeated coldly. Something in his face stopped them this time. Slowly, the riot transformed into desperate organization. Buckets passed hand to hand. Old women received water before armed men. Children drank while workers waited, and through all of it, Ghost kept moving. The black horse found an abandoned handcart near the shed entrance. Even barely able to stand, Ghost allowed ropes to be tied around the chest harness. Slowly, painfully, the exhausted horse dragged several small barrels toward Miriam's relief wagon where the weakest children waited. Every step looked dangerous, every breath sounded dry. But Ghost kept pulling, not because somebody ordered it, because Ghost understood thirst without hatred. By sunset, the violence had mostly stopped. Dustwell looked shattered, broken fences, scattered barrels, guards sitting in silence beside workers they nearly shot hours earlier. And beside Miriam's wagon, Ghost finally collapsed to one knee from exhaustion. Lucy rushed toward him instantly. The little girl wrapped both arms around the horse's neck, while tears ran through the dust on her face. "You saved us before yourself," she whispered against the black mane. Ghost lowered his head weakly beside her shoulder. And for the first time that day, the rider looked toward the dying town and realized Dustwell had crossed something invisible. Not salvation, not peace, but the moment where fear finally stopped hiding the truth. Dustwell survived the riot, but only barely. The broken iron fence around Silas Vane's well still lay scattered across the square the next morning, like the remains of something sacred people no longer believed in. Empty barrels rolled through dusty streets whenever wind passed between buildings. Some windows had been smashed during the chaos. A few guards sat bandaging injuries beside the same workers they almost shot the day before. Nobody trusted anybody completely anymore. But for the first time in years, Dustwell feared thirst more than each other. The rider stood outside Miriam Vale's kitchen, watching people divide the remaining clean water from Silas's hidden reserves. It was organized now. Mothers first, sick children second, elderly third. Caleb Ross enforced the lines with the harsh discipline of a man who understood what happened when panic regained control. Still, it wasn't enough. The rider already knew it. So did everyone else. 3 days of water, maybe 4 if rationed carefully. After that, Dustwell would become violent again. Ghost rested beneath the weak shade beside the kitchen porch. The black horse looked frighteningly exhausted now. Ribs showed clearly beneath the dusty coat. The faded white star on the forehead looked dull beneath dried sweat and sand. The old scars across the shoulders twitched occasionally whenever Ghost tried shifting position. Even breathing looked tiring. But the horse refused rest whenever people moved toward the old well outside town. Ghost kept watching that direction, listening, smelling, waiting. Lucy Ross sat beside him holding the dented tin cup in both hands. The little girl no longer smiled much after the riot. Yesterday had changed something inside every child in Dustwell. Her oversized brown eyes looked older now as she gently wiped dust from Ghost's nose with part of her faded dress. "You should sleep," she whispered. Ghost slowly lifted his head instead, toward the old well. Again, the rider noticed immediately. Miriam stepped outside carrying a worn map torn from an old property ledger. The widow's hands trembled slightly from exhaustion while she spread the paper across the table beside him. Sunburn darkened the skin around her tired eyes, and grief sat heavily in her face after watching Dustwell nearly tear itself apart. "This used to be the community well," Miriam explained quietly while pointing toward faded markings outside town, "before the small earthquake 15 years ago." Caleb approached carrying digging tools over his remaining shoulder. "People said the well died after the collapse," he muttered. "Or maybe they stopped trying because Silas owned the deeper pumps afterward," Miriam answered. The rider looked toward Ghost again. The horse was already struggling to stand. Even barely able to walk steadily now, Ghost still kept staring toward the buried well outside town, as if instinct refused surrender long before humans did. By midday, nearly half of Dustwell gathered outside the abandoned well site. The old stone circle had almost disappeared beneath years of sand and collapsed rock. Broken timber supports jutted from the earth like bones. Heat shimmered across the desert so violently the horizon looked unstable. People began digging anyway, men with shovels, women with rusted mining picks, children carrying away loose stones in broken buckets. The rider worked beside Caleb beneath brutal sunlight while sweat soaked through the dark fabric beneath his leather coat. Dust coated his beard and gloves. Every few minutes, arguments broke out between exhausted workers wanting to quit and others too desperate to stop. "We're digging a grave," one old miner muttered. Another spat into the dirt. "May be better than dying thirsty slow." Miriam moved constantly between workers distributing tiny portions of water while begging people not to collapse from heat exhaustion. Even now she drank less than everyone else. Ghost stayed near the edge of the well site beneath a torn canvas tarp. The horse no longer had strength to help physically. Instead, Ghost simply lay beside the dig site, with ears twitching occasionally toward the ground beneath the rocks. Several people noticed. One frightened woman crossed herself quietly whenever Ghost reacted to the earth. The rider overheard it. "Horse ain't magic," he said flatly while driving his shovel into packed dirt. "No," the woman answered softly. "Maybe people just stopped listening to things trying to help them." That stayed with him longer than expected. Hours passed. The sun burned hotter. Hope weakened. The deeper workers dug, the harder the ground became. Stone replaced sand. Sweat dried instantly on skin. One young worker fainted from heat near sunset. Several others finally dropped their tools entirely. "There's nothing here," somebody shouted angrily. Caleb slammed his shovel into the dirt. "Then leave." The former soldier looked close to violence again. Dust and exhaustion sharpened the dangerous edge already living beneath his grief. The rider stepped between him and the crowd before the argument worsened. "Fighting won't bring water faster," he said quietly. "Neither will digging dead land," another man snapped. Then the rehook happened. Lucy walked silently past the arguing adults, carrying the dented tin cup. Nobody paid attention at first. The little girl climbed carefully down near the deepest part of the dig, where cracked stones blocked further progress. Ghost suddenly lifted his head sharply nearby. Lucy crouched and placed the tin cup against the ground beside the rocks. The entire crowd slowly quieted. Wind passed over the desert. Nothing happened. Then, tick, a tiny sound, barely audible. Lucy froze. Another tiny sound echoed inside the metal cup. Tick. The rider moved closer immediately. Inside the cup sat a single drop of water sliding slowly from a crack between the stones. Nobody spoke, not one person. After months of dust and thirst, the sound of one drop felt louder than gunfire. Several workers started crying quietly, without realizing it. Ghost lowered his head weakly toward the crack in the earth. The horse's ears flicked once. Not excitement. Recognition. As if Ghost had known the old land was still breathing beneath the dead surface all along. Then hoofbeats interrupted the silence. Silas Vane arrived with 6 armed guards. Just before sunset, dust swirled around the wealthy landowner's boots while he dismounted slowly beside the dig site. His cream-colored vest remained immaculate despite the chaos surrounding Dustwell. But something inside him looked older now, more tired. Silas stared at the cracked earth, then at the drop inside Lucy's cup. "This land belongs to me," he said quietly. Nobody moved. Several guards tightened hands around rifles. The rider stepped forward instinctively, but Caleb moved first. The former soldier climbed out of the digging pit, holding his shovel in one hand. Heat, exhaustion, and anger had hollowed his face into something dangerous now. "You gonna arrest thirsty people for digging?" Caleb asked coldly. Silas said nothing. Caleb stepped closer. "Then arrest all of us thirsty." Behind him, workers slowly picked their tools back up, one by one. Shovels, picks, buckets, even exhausted children. Silas looked around at the crowd, not violent anymore. United, that frightened him more. Night fell over Dustwell while lanterns appeared around the old well site. Guards still stood nearby with rifles, but nobody stopped digging now. The rider worked beside Caleb beneath lantern light, while Ghost rested near the edge of the pit, weak eyes half open, ears still listening to the hidden water beneath the earth. And all through the night, the sound of metal striking stone echoed across the desert like people refusing to die quietly anymore. The digging never stopped after midnight. Dustwell glowed beneath scattered lanterns and small campfires, surrounding the old community well, while exhausted people carved deeper into the earth with blistered hands and fading strength. Metal struck stone over and over through the darkness. Some workers took turns sleeping beside the pit for only a few minutes before climbing back down again. Others simply kept digging because stopping meant thinking about thirst again. The rider worked beside Caleb Ross beneath the weak lantern light until his shoulders burned beneath the weight of the shovel. Dust and sweat had hardened into mud along his gloves and coat sleeves. Across the pit, Miriam Vale wrapped cloth around cracked hands while continuing to distribute tiny portions of water to the workers. Nobody had enough strength left for anger anymore, only determination. Ghost remained near the edge of the dig site beneath a torn canvas tarp. The black horse looked fragile now in a way the rider had never seen before. Ribs pressed sharply against the dusty hide. The old scars across the shoulders twitched occasionally beneath shallow breathing. Even lifting the horse's head looked difficult. But Ghost still watched the well constantly, ears moving faintly whenever workers struck certain layers of stone deeper below. Lucy Ross stayed beside Ghost through most of the night. The little girl had fallen asleep once with her head resting against the horse's neck before cold desert wind woke her again before dawn. Even exhausted, Lucy still held the dented tin cup close against her chest. Near sunrise, several guards standing beside Silas Vane finally lowered their rifles completely. One younger guard removed his hat and wiped his face with shaking hands. He looked barely 20, freckles burned dark beneath the desert sun, eyes hollow from weeks watching children beg for water beside loaded guns. "My little brother's sick," the young guard admitted quietly toward Caleb while staring at the digging pit. "Hasn't kept water down in 2 days." Caleb looked at him for a long moment before handing the young man a canteen without speaking. That moment spread through the others. One by one, the guards stopped standing like soldiers protecting property and started standing like tired men afraid for their families. Silas noticed it too. The wealthy landowner stood near the old well wearing the same cream-colored vest, though dust finally clung faintly to the fabric now. He had not slept. The rider could see it in the man's pale face and unfocused eyes. Something inside Silas had begun slipping beyond control the moment the town stopped fearing him more than thirst. He walked slowly toward the pit while workers continued digging beneath him. "You think this changes people?" Silas asked quietly beside the rider. The rider kept working. "I think thirst already changed them long ago." Silas watched the workers in silence. "They'll fight again when the water runs low," he said eventually. "Maybe," the rider answered. Silas looked toward Ghost lying near the edge of the pit. That horse never fought for more than he needed. The rider finally stopped digging. For several seconds neither man spoke, then a shout echoed from deep inside the pit. Workers scrambled backward as a section of rock collapsed inward beneath the final layer of packed earth. The rehook came in silence first. Not water, cold air, a deep, cool breath rising from underground. Every person near the pit froze instantly. Ghost lifted his head sharply despite exhaustion. Then, crack, a sharp splitting sound echoed beneath the earth. One of the miners jumped backward just before a section of stone gave way entirely. Water burst upward through the opening, not violently, not like a miracle, just a rough stream of muddy underground water pushing slowly through broken rock into the dry pit floor. For several seconds, nobody moved. After so many months of dust and thirst, people almost seemed afraid to believe what they were seeing. Then children started crying, not from fear, relief. Miriam covered her mouth with both hands as tears ran down her exhausted face. Caleb sat heavily against the dirt wall beside the pit, like his body suddenly remembered how tired it was. Even several guards looked away quietly while wiping their eyes. The rider simply stared at the water, small, weak, barely enough for survival, but real. Dustwell would not become paradise because of it. The town would still stay poor, still dry, still wounded, but children would drink tomorrow. That mattered. Ghost slowly struggled to stand. The rider moved instantly to help steady the trembling horse, one gloved hand gripping the dusty black mane gently while Ghost stepped toward the flowing water. Every movement looked painful now. The old rear leg limp dragged slightly through the dirt. Lucy hurried forward carrying the dented tin cup. The little girl crouched carefully beside the shallow stream, filling near the broken stones. Her small hands shook while scooping the first clean water Dustwell had seen outside Silas's fence in years. Then Lucy carried the cup toward Ghost. Everyone watched quietly. The black horse lowered his head slowly. For the first time since entering Dustwell, Ghost drank without hesitation. Every drop. A soft breath escaped the crowd afterward like the entire town had been holding air inside their lungs for months. Several days passed after that. Dustwell changed slowly, imperfectly but truly. The old iron fence around Silas's well remained torn apart. Water from the recovered community well was rationed openly instead of sold behind contracts. People still argued, hunger still existed. Some families still packed wagons and left searching for better land farther west. But children no longer collapsed in the streets from thirst. Miriam reopened the relief kitchen, fully using water from the new well to cook real meals again. Caleb organized rotating work crews to keep the well clear without allowing anyone ownership over it. Even some former guards stayed behind to help protect the water equally. Silas Vane changed the least visibly, but one evening the rider saw the older man standing alone beside the old iron fence remains, watching children drink freely from shared buckets. Silas looked smaller somehow, not defeated, just tired of carrying fear alone. On the final morning before leaving Dustwell, the rider prepared Ghost's saddle beside the quiet edge of town. The horse looked stronger already, though still thin from the drought journey. Morning light reflected softly against the faded white star on Ghost's forehead, while the desert wind moved through the black, tangled mane. Lucy approached carrying the dented tin cup carefully in both hands. "You should keep it," she said softly. The rider frowned slightly. "That's yours?" Lucy shook her head. "It kept me alive," she whispered. "Now it should travel." The rider looked down at the small cup for several long seconds, then silently tied it beside the other relics hanging from Ghost's saddle. The cracked horseshoe, the old rein strap, the wooden doll, the iron rail token. When Ghost shifted weight, the cup tapped softly against the saddle leather, a sound small enough to resemble a single drop of water. A few days later, dark clouds finally appeared far above the distant desert horizon. Not a storm yet, maybe not even rain, but enough to make Dustwell stop and look upward again. The town remained poor, still wounded, still surviving day by day, but people had stopped dying alone. At sunrise, the rider mounted Ghost and rode slowly away from Dustwell. The black horse stopped once at the top of the ridge overlooking town. Far south beyond the desert mountains, a dark column of smoke rose into the morning sky. Ghost stared toward it for a long time. The rider adjusted his gloves quietly, then both disappeared into the desert light together. Sometimes God does not send miracles the way people expect. Sometimes he sends them quietly, through tired hands that keep digging, through strangers who refuse to abandon each other, or through a wounded horse that still chooses kindness while the world is falling apart. Dustwell was not saved by magic. The town was saved the moment people stopped protecting survival only for themselves and started sharing it together. In everyday life, many people are carrying invisible droughts inside them: loneliness, fear, exhaustion, grief, or the feeling that nobody sees their pain anymore. But hope often begins the same way it did in Dustwell, with one small act of mercy that refuses to die. A single cup of water, a hand reaching back, someone choosing compassion before comfort. If this story touched your heart, share where you are watching from in the comments. Tell us what moment stayed with you the most. And if you want to continue riding beside the rider and Ghost, through more forgotten towns and broken souls searching for light, don't forget to subscribe and stay on the trail with us. May God watch over everyone listening tonight. May he give water to the thirsty, peace to the weary, strength to the broken, and hope to those who feel lost in the desert of life.